was a woman in Georgia, didn't feel just right. She had fever all day and chills at night. Now things gotten worse, yes, a serious bind. In times like this, it takes a man of a style like getting out of a vine. A doctor of the heart and a doctor of the mind.
Hi, this is Colin McEnroe. Welcome back from your weekends. We have discovered during the pandemic that there are consequences, certain specific consequences to having a president who made his mark in reality TV shows and beauty pageants, which is to say everything is a competition. The states are free to compete among themselves for resources, for PPEs, for testing equipment. And now it looks like the vaccines may have to compete against one another in some kind of collective pageant. So there's... Basically, it's the Hunger Games, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to talk in the second half of today's show with a doctor who's been on the front lines in one of the hospitals while all this is going down. He has a very interesting background. He's no stranger to my show at all. But let's begin with epidemiology. And to do that, we are lucky to have with us Greg Gonsalves, who is co-director of the Global Health Justice Partnership at Yale Law School and an assistant professor of epidemiology at the Yale School of Public Health. Also writes a weekly series for The Nation. He's been with us before. We're happy to have him back. Greg, good to have you again.
Thanks, Colin.
So let's begin with what I stole this term from Bloomberg Prognosis, but the paradox of pandemic success. You know, to the extent that there's any kind of argument going on about our public health response, and as we know, there is an argument going on about our public health response, we seem to hear, you know, that, well, I mean, what has happened, I think, is that we have won the first battle in what's likely to be kind of a long war with massive casualties. But we've got people who point to the putatively low death rate and say, well, you see, you didn't need to do that lockdown. And they seem to not understand, as I think that you would say, that the shutdown, if there is a low death rate, it's attributable to the shutdown, right?
So a couple of things. One is, you know, we just passed probably moments ago or the past few hours, 100,000 deaths from coronavirus in the United States. We have the largest number of deaths in the world. We have the largest number of deaths in terms of nations that are comparable to us in terms of socioeconomic or socioeconomic status or industrialized status. And so 100,000 is not a small number. No. Yes, the projections could have been far worse. And we could have seen, you know, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of deaths. But, you know, Americans sort of rallied together, and many of us stayed at home over the past 6 to 8 to 10 weeks and protected each other and drove those deaths down. But it's not a small number by any means. I mean, you know, I'm here in Connecticut. 100,000 deaths is just below the population of Hartford, Connecticut. The town I grew up in on Long Island in New York, it was about 30,000 people. So that would be 3 of my hometowns wiped out over the course of 3 to 4 months. So right. There's no success here.
No. Well, I mean, some would say that there's at least a success in the sense that the curve is bent in some places and the hospitals haven't been overwhelmed. That some of what we have done, I heard Daniel Griffin on This Week in Virology say that he considers that we have won the first battle in the COVID-19 war. He thinks it's going to be a long war and that there are other, but yes, with massive casualties, I think is the point that you're making.
With massive casualties. And the other point is that, you know, a report came out from Imperial College of Medicine on Sunday that said 24 of the 50 states in the U.S. have uncontrolled epidemics, right? And so with half of the country with epidemics that they can't sort of contain, you wonder where we'll be 6 months from now, because, you know, containing COVID in one part of the country and letting it still spread in another part of the country is like having a peeing section in a swimming pool. It doesn't work, right? Yeah. And so we either rise or we fall together. And so I don't know. I'm more pessimistic than you might be. I think 100,000 deaths is just astronomical. I think we failed miserably. at a political level, on the federal level. I think there's some blame probably in New York City to go around, in New York State to go around, in terms of the sort of competition between the governor and the mayor there, which delayed the response there as well. Could it have been worse? Yeah, it could have been worse. But the death toll is just too high to say that we have any sort of claim to victory at the present moment.
Right. I for the record, I'm pretty pessimistic. I'm rhetorically optimistic. This gets to the whole question of numbers themselves, and what we seem to be running into, because so much of your profession, epidemiology, involves deriving insight from numbers, and then the question is coming up whether you can always trust the numbers or the way the numbers are being presented. It puts me in mind of a term that emerged on the television series The Wire. Kat, let's hear that.
If we're teaching the kids the test questions, what is it assessing in them?
Nothing. It assesses us. The test scores go up. They can say the schools are improving. The scores stay down. They can't.
Juking the stats.
Excuse me?
Making robberies into larcenies. Making rapes disappear. You juke the stats and majors become colonels.
Juking the stats was their term, whether it was in crime statistics or educational statistics, for presenting numbers in a way that look unduly positive and disguise their meaning. So, I mean, I'm kind of a newcomer to epidemiology, but I've really gotten fascinated by it and tried to learn as much as I can. So I was pretty astonished to find out that not only are several states combining two kinds of data on testing, but the CDC seems to be doing this too. So we're talking about, on the one hand, diagnostic testing. That's to find out who has the disease right now, and serological testing or antibody testing. That's to find out who has had the disease. So it's sort of like combining active duty personnel with veterans. And the number that you get, I would assume, is not a particularly helpful number. It doesn't really tell you the truth about active cases or post-active cases, right?
Well, it's juking the stats, as you said. I mean, the point is that the antibody tests, the serological tests, are saying you're infected or exposed to the virus, and tells you one thing about the epidemiology of the disease. Well, the PCR tests, the diagnostic tests themselves, they talk about active infection, and they're not the same thing. Your active duty versus veterans comparison is apt. I mean, if we want to talk about death tolls from the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, we could add veterans of foreign wars back to Vietnam, and it'll all look a lot less gruesome, right? And so the fact that we've seen Georgia and Florida come under suspicion for juking the stats is one thing, but the idea that the CDC was doing this, it doesn't compute to me, right? They're talented, wonderful people who work there, who are committed to public health. I just feel like sort of the rot of what's been happening over the past few years has sort of seeped down to the level of the agency, and there's captives of the political and the political masters in DC now, and they're being told to juke the stats, and that's what they did.
Yeah. And just to sort of make it clear, I mean, there's sort of two obvious, not particularly admirable reasons why somebody might do this. If you combine diagnostic with serological testing, you get a larger number of tests. It looks like you're doing more testing.
Yep.
And you're going to lower the perceived infection rate from the diagnostic tests. The diagnostic tests, you'll disguise the infection rate by combining two different rates, right?
Yeah, and while that make the president of the United States happy, it serves nobody else really, because the way to respond to a disease is by knowing how it's spreading across the United States, across our towns, counties, our states, across the country, and we want to know where active infections are. When we do contact tracing and isolation, we're looking for active infection, and people who are harboring the virus right now can pass it on to their neighbors or their family or their friends. Antibody studies will show us, who's potentially exposed and potentially immune to the virus, meaning it gives us a sense of how extent of the course of this epidemic has been in terms of reaching out into the sort of four corners of our country. They're asking two different questions, and we need reliable information to make public health policies and to figure out how to sort of move forward into this next sort of set of challenges that we face. And reliable data is key. And it's baffling to me that since the beginning, we've had questions about how data was being collected on hospitalizations, on all sorts of things, even beyond the PCR and the antibody tests. So we've had a sort of data fiasco as well as a testing fiasco.
Right. And so, I mean, we've had things, for example, like in Florida, they fired the woman who designed their data dashboard. And she said she was being fired because they didn't want the kind of transparency that she provided and advocated for. But to have the CDC do something like this, I mean, it would just be kind of a rookie mistake if anybody else did it. I mean, it's such an obviously wrong thing to do. And one thing that has become clear to me is that going into this, the CDC was the world standard. It was the greatest public health agency in the world. It was the agency that other nations looked to for expertise and reliability. And that all just seems kind of in ruins right now.
Well, I wouldn't go that far. I think, there's still people there who are vital parts of our public health approach in the United States, our public health defense in the United States. It's just the politics have been stirred up down there so sort of carelessly, from President Trump down to Secretary Azar, down to CDC Director Redfield, that it's not ruined forever, but it's definitely an agency in chaos at the current moment, just in terms of its reputation and its ability to lead us. The CDC has been largely invisible for the past several months in terms of its role in protecting the American public health, which is sort of what its statutory role is, what its historical role has been.
So, you talked about the Imperial College study. Basically, it sort of looks at what the reproduction rates are state by state in this country. The good news, if you want to be an optimist, the good news is that, for example, places like Connecticut, the reproduction rate is less than 1. That's sort of, really, really good news if you can hold it there. But their point was essentially that increased mobility following the relaxation of social distancing is going to lead to a resurgence of transmissions. And they're predicting that deaths over the next 2-month period would exceed the current cumulative deaths. That's like the 100,000 number that we've been talking about, by greater than twofold. I mean, they also said that they were sort of pessimistic in the way that they'd set this up, but that's a terrifying statement, exceeding the cumulative number by twofold. Yeah,
and as I've been saying over the past few weeks, is that all models are wrong, but some are useful.
Yes,
and it's an old quip by a statistician from the UK named George Box. The point is that the Imperial College model, the point estimates, the single numbers that they show in news reports on it, don't sort of don't let it obscure the sort of larger picture which they're trying to tell us, which is that half the country has not controlled their epidemics. The entire country is relaxing social distancing. And what we're going to end up seeing is a resurgence in virus in different places around the country. I often wake up and read my New York Times, and I look at the case counts, and I look at the sort of where the newer hotspots are. And yes, more testing means we're going to find more cases, but it's pretty clear that according to the Imperial report, the clusters of these states that are seeing sort of uncontrolled epidemics are moving to the South and to the Midwest. So if there was a first sort of wave of the epidemic, it was, in the Northeast, maybe in the Northwest. And now we're seeing it head south and to the center of the country. The point is that, there's a lot of wishful thinking that it's just going to go away and that, it's going to disappear on its own. We'll wake up one morning, it'll be gone. It's just, that's what it is. It's wishful thinking. And it's just, we're in for a long phase epidemiological event that's not going to end, on Labor Day.
So, in some ways, the good news and the bad news, another set of good news and bad news is, we without a vaccine or any really meaningful therapeutic drug at this point, we are essentially relegated to using the same tools that we used against smallpox. That's sort of bad news. But the good news is that works, right? It actually does work to isolate, to social distance. The things that were useful, all that long time ago are still very effective.
Yeah, look, we could celebrate if we had a vaccine, but it wouldn't be, in all our bodies tomorrow. We'd still have to deal with sort of standard public health practice. This idea of case identification, contact tracing and isolation is old. It's old school. It's from the 19th century in Leicester, England, when they were trying to deal with smallpox epidemics there. The point is we can bring down case counts by doing what we've been saying for, now it seems like years, but it's only been months, of test, trace, and isolate. This is what's happening in countries all around the world. If you look, I think I saw an article this morning that, South Korea, I think, had a set of new cases, mm-hmm. and they massively tested and isolated, several hundred new cases that they had found in their subsequent wave of infection.
Yeah, well, Wuhan, I think they just tested 9 million people in 2 weeks and found 180 asymptomatic people. I mean, this is that's the kind of massive testing that you look for, and the tracing and the isolating. What you need is you need to find that asymptomatic person who isn't on your radar screen for any particular reason yet, but is standing there in the Dairy Queen line coughing.
Yeah, exactly. Well, yeah, and the main thing is that everybody's like, oh, it's so hard. It's not just China. It's South Korea. It's Singapore. It's Denmark. It's New Zealand. We can go country after country that's basically done this. And so, there's some weird. It's more than complacency. It's sort of defeatism that says, it's not possible for us to do this. That the costs are too high to trying to do this, even though the prospect of even another 100,000 deaths in the U.S. is incalculable, and I'm talking economically and epidemiologically and sort of morally. But for some reason we've decided we're not the can-do nation, we're the can't-do nation in terms of a public health response that a dozen other countries have figured out how to do.
So the way in which we're trying to do a can-do nation is vaccines. There's a very odd story that's out today, and I think Reuters broke it, and there hasn't been a lot of time to digest it. But they reported that the U.S. is planning this massive testing. Well, I talked about it at the top of the show. It's almost like a vaccine pageant or something, that it will compress what is typically, years and years of vaccine development into a matter of months. The test will involve about 100,000 volunteers and half a dozen or so of the most promising vaccine candidates. This seems to be part of this Operation Warp Speed push from the White House. Moderna, which people have probably heard a lot about, will be no doubt part of it, and maybe the AstraZeneca Oxford University one too. Although, again, Greg, I'm kind of new to all this, but I don't think I've ever heard about a trial that got a whole bunch of vaccines together all at once and kind of pitted them against each other.
Well, yeah, they do all the time. I mean, when we talk about control groups in studies, you can look at, you want to have a placebo arm, and then you could look at one or more vaccines together. The idea of compressing vaccine development into these large trials in which you're enrolling lots of people and you're looking at more than one vaccine at a time is not a bad idea. One of the things I think we have to realize is that wishing doesn't make it so. And the 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 vaccines they put in those trials could simply not be effective, and it still means we have to invest for the long haul in terms of vaccine development. I mean, the weird thing about this sort of idea that we're going to have a vaccine in 6 months or 12 months is that it's setting these unreasonable expectations. If we are not successful in developing a vaccine over the next year, are Americans going to lose their appetite for supporting that kind of research? Hopefully not. But ramping up vaccine development, expediting clinical trials is fine to do. Now we just have to cross our fingers and pray that one of these vaccines works.
Meanwhile, and we've talked a lot about this on this show, the other end of this is the idea of therapeutic drugs, maybe drugs that are administered pretty early in the infection before these kind of secondary downstream effects from the immune system kick in. There's been some suggestion that, maybe that's where some of the urgency should also go. Obviously there are a lot of trials right now also looking at something, beyond remdesivir. But, what are your thoughts about that? Obviously resources are almost infinite at this point because everybody seems to be willing to put an awful lot of money and effort into the game. Is there enough effort going on that therapeutic front?
Well, I have friends at an activist group in New York called Prep for All, and the old organization I used to work with called Treatment Action Group. Both have sort of started putting out reports on the sort of pipeline of treatments for COVID-19. Ones for symptomatic infection and keeping people alive longer than without a drug. And then the idea of pre-exposure prophylaxis or a preventive pill. We do that for HIV right now. You can pop a pill and reduce your risk of transmission of HIV from a infected partner to an uninfected partner, basically to zero. And that's what we're looking at, both a preventive approach using drugs rather than a vaccine, and a therapeutic one that extends survival for people who are sick. The bad thing is that there's a whole sort of lemming-like effect in terms of hydroxychloroquine, and there've been, if you look at clinicaltrials.gov, where people register clinical trials that are in design or up and running, there's a whole load of hydroxychloroquine studies were initiated in March, April, and May of this year. And it's not quite sure that there's a sort of concerted effort to go through drug company and other private sector chemical libraries or public ones in the public domain to screen them for activity against COVID-19. Yes, it's happening, but is there a quote unquote Manhattan Project to do something like this? It's not quite sure. There's an Operation Warp Speed on the therapeutic side right now.
Yeah, and a lot of this also seems to be even just trying to understand the disease too. Somebody compared this to a doctor doing surgery and having people run in periodically with a brand new scalpel that's just been invented. There's a way in which the disease is still being studied. It has some pretty unusual qualities to it that aren't well mirrored by other coronaviruses. There are things that seem to work in the early stages that by activating the immune system that might actually be deleterious in the later stages when the immune system seems to be overactive. So, it is like trying to develop a drug for a disease you haven't quite mastered an understanding of. Is that fair to say?
Well, the thing about screening compounds in drug libraries is that sometimes you don't need to know the mechanism of action. Mm-hmm. If there's sort of rational drug design in which you sort of pick a viral protein and you target it, or a viral gene and you target its products, that's sort of based on sort of an elaborate knowledge of how that gene and its subsequent proteins work. But you can just put drugs in a petri dish, put it along with virus, and see if it affects the virus and not know what it does downstream. A lot of the old school drug screening protocols did that. They put stuff in the presence of something in their chemical libraries and saw if it worked, and then they sort of refined it based on that. And we didn't necessarily need to know the mechanism of action. The early HIV drugs like AZT was a cancer drug. Put back on the shelf. They screened it for HIV. It looked like it worked, and then it was the first AIDS drug approved. So, we are learning as we're doing, and we don't know a lot about the virus yet. But there's ways to approach drug development, even in the sort of absence of perfect knowledge or extensive knowledge about a virus.
Let me ask you about one last thing. It's maybe one of the less appetizing questions. On the other hand, we do have some Yale pride about this. A sewage study by scientists at Yale found that RNA concentrations of SARS-CoV-2 were a 7-day leading indicator. When you read this study, it's pretty amazing kind of how on the nose the readings from the sewage are 6 or 7 days out.
Well, not to be gross, but what goes in comes out, right? Yeah. So it just the point is that feces and urine and other sort of excreta from human bodies ends up in our sewers, and all the viruses and bacteria and other things that came into our body go out with it. And so it doesn't surprise me. I think it's actually a nice way to think about sort of environmental monitoring for infectious diseases. It's also a place to think about scooping up some sewage and thinking about what else is in there that we don't know about. We're talking about it as looking at COVID, but it could also be a harbinger for the emergence of other infectious diseases that could be the next endemic down the road. So I think a lot of people have talked about doing this, and I'm glad they've done it in terms of looking at it for coronavirus spread.
Right. And for this coronavirus, I mean, if these numbers hold up, they're pretty interesting just in the sense that because the testing is kind of all over the map and the diagnostic testing is aimed in certain directions and there's not enough of it, it's, that's still a lot of sort of noise in the signal thing. Hospitalizations are kind of a hard number that you can look at. Death is kind of a lagging indicator. It's really sort of 2, 3, 4 weeks down the line. But to have something that would be predictive of an outbreak, something that would actually tell you numbers before they show up in other places, that's not a small thing.
Well, it's just another sort of signal that we can use to think about the states and the localities that have their epidemics under control or they don't. You can look at the individual level and test you or me, or you can go to the environmental level and test sewage, for instance, to see what's coming out through the pipes, basically. And so it's another way to monitor what's going on in our nation's public health and our local public health.
We're going to stop there, but thank you so much for your time. Greg Gonsalves, I hope you'll come back, co-director of the Global Health Justice Partnership at Yale Law School, assistant professor of epidemiology at the Yale School of Public Health, also writes a weekly series for The Nation. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks, Colin. All
right, we're going to take a break. We're going to come back. You're going to meet a guy you've met before, but not maybe in this context.
Miss the Saturday dance. Heard they crowded the floor. Couldn't bear it without you. Don't get around much anymore. Thought I'd visit the club. Got as far as the door.
All right. So years and years and years ago, I used to listen to a show called Valley Folk, hosted by Susan Forbes Hansen. And every once in a while, this voice would come on the show, and I'd go, wow, that's that guy that I like. This is the guy. What is his name? This is the guy that I like a lot. And his name was Hugh Blumenfeld. And I did like his music a lot, and I still do. And I eventually got to know him, and we've stayed in touch. And then he became a doctor, partly because of becoming a father and having a prematurely born infant. It just sort of radicalized him, and he'll tell you all about it. But before we bring him on, Hugh Blumenfeld is a family physician in Hartford. He's also still a singer-songwriter, former English professor, and Connecticut's 7th state troubadour. And before we let Hugh speak, let's hear a song of his. This is called Hole in the Sky.
Fine air still falling, the dust covered everything. Street sweepers wash down the streets every hour. 2 in the morning, the sidewalks were crowded with tourists, pilgrims, and grave volunteers. Shrine after shrine, like a child's valentine, and a love far beyond their years. There's a hole in the sky. There's a place.
All right, so that's Hugh singing, but we're actually going to be talking about Hugh doctoring today and his shift to a physician and what it's like during a pandemic like this one. So, Hugh Blumenfeld, welcome back to our show.
Thanks for having me on.
So, I guess maybe I'd like to start here. That was the song we just played, was about another tragedy that many of us. For many of us, I think it might have been the closest thing to the shock we've experienced during this pandemic. And one of the things that I think you talk about a lot is our capacity for empathy. I don't have this disease. You don't have this disease. We don't want to get this disease. But right now, a lot of other people do. And maybe we could just talk, you could talk a little bit about how that emotion and idea of empathy is excited in you.
I've been thinking a lot about empathy because I started thinking about it as a songwriter, as an artist, and really trying to make distinction between empathy, where you really try to go after somebody else's experience of what's going on, and sympathy, which is where, if somebody else is feeling something, you feel you feel the same thing. And in art, I found that sympathy is where you identify with the song. So a lot of pop music is sympathy. Somebody saying, I love you, I love you, I love you, I need you, and you feel that yourself. And that's the whole point of pop music. But with folk songs, which were stories, you're supposed to actually imagine the experience of somebody else. And what I found is these distinctions were not so clear in medicine. And a lot of caregivers are suffering because of this confusion between empathy and sympathy. And so I've been really trying to explore what exactly is it that is required of us as caregivers in responding to human suffering. Because we have to both protect ourselves, and we also have to, if our work is our life, we need to make these encounters really be deep. You can't distance yourself emotionally either. So I've been trying to define this for myself and for the people I work with and the people I train.
Yeah, it's a tightrope though, because there is some kind of clinical detachment that's important, right? You can't allow yourself to be completely overwhelmed by the emotional part, but you also don't want to keep the emotional part so much at bay that you miss the point of the other human being.
I don't know about the detachment though. I mean, for instance, when you see Romeo and Juliet, if I said, hey, I'm going to show you a play about teenage double suicide, you're going to say, why would I want to see that? Or if I'm going to show you a picture of one of those paintings of Saint Sebastian, and I say, I'm going to show you a guy full of arrows, you're going to say, no, that's gross. Don't do that. But when we look at artwork and the transformation of suffering, we perceive it as beautiful. We perceive it as having meaning, and we're deeper because of our emotional engagement with those works of art. And what I've been trying to think about is, instead of detachment as a model, what is it that we're called to do when we imagine what's going on with somebody, where we join with their experience in a way that, we don't suffer, but we grow through our emotional attachment to what they're going through. I think detachment is the wrong model, really.
I feel also that the conversation we're having now is what, for me, is typically missing in the news that I consume about this pandemic. In other words, I think, we in the news tend to talk about things like, well, I mean, we flattened the curve, we bent the curve, we avoided overwhelming the capacity of hospitals. There are, ICU beds that aren't full at the moment. I mean, all of this is sort of a pretty numerical way of understanding what's happening. And then maybe another thing that we do focus on is the death count and the fact that it's at 100,000. And I think what we don't focus on very much, and therefore the average person maybe doesn't have as much of an opportunity to think about, is just how much suffering goes on with this disease. You don't have to die from this disease to be made completely miserable in a way that will leave a permanent scar on you, is the sense I get.
Yeah, it is. It's not just worse than the flu. It seems to be like a fundamentally different experience to go through. I have people who've been through a lot of illnesses, and this is just, people are short of breath just sitting up, and then they're taking weeks to recover. And taking care of patients in the hospital, we're doing stuff that we normally do for respiratory illnesses, and it doesn't do anything. And it's frustrating, and it's a little scary that way.
Right. I think one thing that I've heard, and maybe I've heard it from you too, is that sometimes the person isn't huffing and puffing. They're not short of breath that way. It's that the breaths that they're taking are not getting oxygen into their blood the way it's supposed to.
Yeah, and normally you would huff and puff with that. Normally your body would sense you're not getting enough oxygen. But I was, at least my small experience so far is I was surprised at how low people's oxygen would go, and they didn't seem to be, in that kind of acute distress, but they just stopped getting enough oxygen.
We're all watching clinical trials, and you might have heard me talking to Greg Gonsalves about various drugs and antivirals and convalescent plasma and all this kind of stuff. What's been kind of amazing is that this technique known as proning, where you're basically simply turning the patient over, has been apparently one of the more effective things to do. This just incredibly basic human thing has produced some pretty significant relief to patients. One question that I had is, there isn't time for there to be peer-reviewed papers put out there on proning. Is this something that just sort of gets around by kind of an oral tradition? This is working, let's do it some more?
Well, it's actually something that's been around for a long time. Respiratory therapists have known of this. Cystic fibrosis patients, for instance, benefit a lot from these kind of things, from proning and from even head downward positioning. It's not magic. As a matter of fact, a friend of mine was texting me about it way before people started showing up in the hospital, and so it didn't surprise me when we started doing it. Part of the problem is it's actually hard for patients to tolerate being in the prone position for very long, especially bigger people. It's just hard to stay on your stomach.
Yeah. There actually are, I guess, in some cases, in some hospitals, to your point about this having been around for a while, these actual proning beds that rotate. It's almost like being a rotisserie chicken or something that you can actually sort of turn.
And they've done that in the ICU for certain respiratory illnesses, all along. Mm-hmm. So, but yeah, it opens up spaces in the lung that you really need.
Yeah,
it's much more ergonomically efficient.
All right, so we're going to take a quick break. We're going to come back with more of Hugh Blumenfeld, talk a little bit more about what he's feeling and experiencing as he works against this disease. Got to say some special thank yous here to Kat Pastor. She's in the studio making it possible for us to work remotely. And the senior producer for the Colin McEnroe Show is Betsy Kaplan. This episode is her episode, so thanks very much to her. Tomorrow on the show, it's going to be a full-length, wide-ranging conversation with another person I've known for a really long time. In fact, I either sat next to her or across from her at work for 9 years, but who's counting? Susan Campbell will join me. We'll talk about a lot of things. Kat is going to have to check the button that she presses if somebody swears, make sure that works. So anyway, there's that to look forward to. But right now, we're with Hugh Blumenfeld. I met him first as a singer, songwriter, musician, and then I've watched his career change as he became a physician. So, Hugh, I should have asked you this question before I asked you anything else. How are you? This has got to be hard. You're watching people be very sick, in some cases watching people die, and you haven't been able to solve the problem and help them. You probably also feel a little bit at risk yourself being in that environment. So how are you?
So far, so good. 82 days without a fever, something like that. I did, I had the opportunity to move out of my house and stay at a friend's, little apartment. So I actually just moved home for the first time over the weekend since I started working in the hospital. It's warm out. I built myself an outdoor shower, so I'm back at home. But besides that, pretty lucky. I work in an office. We've got 30 doctors and 20 staff people, and knock on wood, nobody's actually gotten sick yet. It's a lot of social distancing and people telecommuting and seeing patients by video or by telephone pretty much exclusively for the last couple of months. And then working in the hospital, yes, working in the hospital is hard. People are used to doing things for patients and having it worked. And, in a way, we're back to the old model of hospital medicine, which is, people get admitted to the hospital and you watch them to see if they get better or not. we have some things we try, but there's really, as you said, there's no real evidence for a lot of what we're doing. You talked about proning. We do that. We try to diurese people, like get some fluid off, because fluid seems to be collecting in the tissues of the lung. We put everybody on anticoagulants, because a lot of this illness, with all the inflammation, people are getting blood clots in the lungs, or blood clots. People getting heart attacks from this. So, but again, there's no evidence, so we throw stuff and see what sticks.
One of the things that you have mentioned to me is that perhaps the unsung heroes. Well, you even talk about a thing like proning, okay? So proning means that 3 or 4 people, nurses and aides, presumably, are going to have to gown up and put on all their PPEs and go into a room where a person is really sick with a rather frightening disease and physically turn that person's body over. These people, I mean, as you say, they are kind of maybe the unsung heroes of all this.
Yeah, I've always said that, again, I feel really lucky. The nurses are hands-on all the time, the aides, the janitorial staff, people who are stocking all the rooms. These people, some people did not take an oath to do all this. Some people, this was not what they had in mind when they took a job. And they have a lot more exposure than the rest of us, really. And they do it unquestioningly. It's just amazing. It's amazing to work in the hospital and be with everybody. And my experience has been the morale is actually pretty high. Everybody's working together.
I think most people those of us who have really the comparatively luxurious opportunity to work from home and to, limit our contact and do the things that we're supposed to do. I even find still that the amount of vigilance that I'm at least asking of myself is, it kind of gnaws at you. You're constantly trying to remember when was the last time you washed your hands, if you're out in your car, with the dog or whatever, should I use a hand sanitizer, all this kind of stuff. That's nothing compared to what you guys are having to deal with. And I just sort of wonder, for you and for these nurses and aides, just the constant, donning and doffing of all this protective equipment, constantly having to worry, I would assume that, that you haven't made some kind of mistake that's opened you to an inoculum. There must be kind of a weird pressure with that. Or do you just get so used to it that it's all second nature?
Well, I don't know that it's become second nature, but yeah, people have described that this is really the thing that makes you so tired at the end of the day, is this constant vigilance. And putting on all the equipment is onerous, but it's the taking off of the equipment is where your heart rate goes up, because you realize that if you don't take everything off completely correctly, the whole purpose of wearing it can go out the window. All you have to do is touch something that's been contaminated by not having you put on your gloves in the right order. We have videos about how to specifically to take off the equipment so that you don't contaminate yourself. But the vigilance, just that's what's taking the toll emotionally.
Right. I mean, it's called donning and doffing in the medical world. Kind of old-fashioned words for a very modern source of anxiety. So, is there enough stuff? Do you guys have enough masks, enough N95s? I mean, how has that worked out?
It depends what you mean by enough, but basically N95s, we have been reusing them and recycling them. So when I was working in the hospital, I do one week shifts in the hospital, and I'm about to start another one this coming weekend. But basically, I have 3 N95s, and I use the first one, and I try to use the same one for the whole day. And it means you have to see patients in a certain order. You see all your non-COVID patients first, and then the suspects, and then the people who have COVID. And at the end of the day, you take your mask and you put it in a brown paper bag and leave it open. And the next day you use a second mask, and the third day you use a third mask, and the fourth day you use the first mask that's been sitting in a paper bag for 3 days. So by doing that, we've saved a lot of masks, and we haven't run into a shortage. My first day in the hospital for my last shift, we had run out of gowns, the disposable gowns, and we were using recyclable gowns, which meant that gowns were all over the place, hanging on doors and in big bags waiting to be recycled. But then after a couple of days, a new shipment of gowns came in. everybody seems to have enough protection in the hospital. The place where people don't have protection, and this is the real tragedy, is in the nursing homes and the facilities, the residential facilities. I've had so many of my patients who've gotten COVID have been the ones who are caregivers at those facilities where they didn't have sufficient PPE.
There's a way in which, as a singer, as a songwriter, as the person I first got to know, you, I think, dreamed of change and chafed at unfairness. I just saw a report from the Global Health Security Index, which graded every country on its pandemic preparedness last year. The United States had the highest overall score, 83.5. But on access to healthcare specifically, it scored just 25.3. It tied with Gambia for 175th place. And in a way, you sort of wonder at the end of all this, are nursing homes going to get better? Are we going to be a little bit more vigilant about standards in nursing homes? Is access to healthcare going to get better? Are we going to just sort of take this thing and when it's quote unquote over, put it behind us? Or are we going to look at some of the flaws that really were revealed here? I mean, I think we all know it didn't have to be quite as bad as it has been. And there are a lot of things that are fixable, that are wrong. I wonder what you're thinking, though. I mean, are you hopeful that we take this as an opportunity to see what was sort of structurally wrong and unfair about our system?
Well, a boy can dream, I suppose. Ever since going into healthcare, I was never obviously as informed about the inequalities and the difficulties. The fact that we're an advanced country and access to healthcare depends on whether you have a job and where that job is such a big part of the problem that we're having now. And combine that with the problem with leadership at the top, it was just kind of a perfect storm. I'm hoping that people realize that all of our health depends on the health of the least of us, in the most basic way. And so maybe there is a message here that will help change things for the better.
So I guess my last question for you is, what are your outlets? Can you still, if you're not on a 1 week hospital rotation, can you pick up a guitar and play? Can you do things to sort of get yourself out of the frame of mind where you're worried about making a mistake with your PPEs?
I've actually been playing the saxophone a lot, trying to learn the violin, which was my first instrument, and spending time with the family. I go home and we socially distance, and now that it's warmer. It was a frustrating month. It was all cold and rainy almost every day. I would try to go home and visit everybody and sit on the porch for 20 minutes, and we'd say, "Okay, that's good enough."
Yeah.
But yeah, there's plenty to relax with, fortunately.
All right. Well, Hugh Blumenthal, thank you so much for spending time with us. And yeah, you're right about the weather. One of the things they're telling us now is, there are no perfect solutions, but outdoors is better than indoors, and certainly further away is better than closer. So if you can be outdoors and a viable distance away, it's one of the ways that maybe the warm weather can be your friend. Hugh Blumenthal, you've been a good friend to me for so many years. Thanks for doing this today.
Don't be afraid. Just be careful.
All right. That sounds like very, very good advice. Don't be afraid. Be careful. Thank you so much for listening today, too. And thanks again, once again, to Kat and to Betsy Kaplan. And we're battening down the hatches for tomorrow with Susan Campbell.
A PhD in swing, he's a master